Welcome back to the Oscar Project Podcast, the show where I discuss Oscar-nominated films year by year. I am your host, Jonathan Eacherberg, and today I'm bringing you an author interview with Brad Weismann, author of the recently published book, Horror Unmasked, A History of Terror from Nosferatu to Nope. Before I jump into the interview, please subscribe to the show in your podcast player so you can get all the newest episodes as soon as they're released. If you like the interview and want to hear more, please consider leaving a rating and review in Apple Podcasts or Spotify. Brad Weismann is an award-winning writer and journalist, and has also worked as a featured stand-up comic and improv actor. He's contributed to publications and websites worldwide, such as Senses of Cinema, Film International, Backstage, Movie Habit, Colorado Daily, and Boulder Magazine. His first book, Lost in the Dark, A World History of Horror Films, was recently published by the University of Mississippi, and he contributed to the critical collection 100 Years of Soviet Cinema. He joins me today to talk about his new book, Horror Unmasked, A History of Terror from Nosferatu to Nope. Brad, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it, Jonathan.
Great. So let's start off with what a horror film truly is. You cite a quote from director Terence Fisher that the best horror films are adult fairy tales. What does this really mean, and is that the best way to understand horror as an entire film genre?
I think that when Terence Fisher said that, he was saying that these are their journeys into fear, I think, is the best way to describe them. It's a way of testing yourself, a way of going into a dark room with other people and seeing something scary and surviving it, surpassing it. It seems to me that in all horror movies, there are at least two elements. There is the fact that there's a threat, whether from the outside or from the inside, and that it's something that can't be rationally explained. If you watch Scooby-Doo, you notice they always manage to come up with a rational explanation by the end of the episode. But true horror doesn't give you that.
Right. And now one of the things you noted in your discussion about horror films of the 1930s was the raft of films based on the same characters. You saw Dracula, the Mummy, and Frankenstein always appearing again and again, sometime in each other's films. And I can't help but notice the similarity to Marvel or DC films of today. Why do you think this tends to happen periodically in film, especially in horror?
I think it's a cash grab, frankly. I think that horror is very dollars and cents oriented. And if you can throw more characters from other film series in together, you increase the chances of people going to see the film. I think this is very much the case with the comic book films of today, the DC and the Marvel movies, and the fact that the idea, well, for instance, a DC screenwriter said, when you get to Batman versus Superman, you're out of ideas. And of course they did Batman versus Superman. So in horror, it's more of a case of trying to draw in as many people as humanly possible. That's the case for Freddy versus Jason, all those things.
Excellent. And you also noted throughout the book that horror tends to go in trends. Multiple directors and studios pick on whatever happens to be working at the time. Why is this? And with the recent post-horror boom that you talk about at the end of the book, what do you think might be the next horror trend?
Oh, that's a great question. I think the quote-unquote post-horror bubble is kind of popped, and I think that has already come and gone. We've seen a return to much more traditional types of horror movies in the past couple of years. I don't know where it's going in next. I think that one trend I noticed before we got to that particular trend, was the idea that there are straight dramatic films with horror elements in them. Mm-hmm. And that there's more depth and complexity of characterization. There's better plots. There's more elevated dialogue. But it's a horror film. If you look at Get Out and The Shape of Water, two Oscar-winning films, you find one is a genuine horror film, and the other, The Shape of Water, was so good that they couldn't call it a horror film, so they called it a fantasy film, which happens often.
Sure, and then that one went on to win Best Picture, which you
almost
never see a horror film do.
Except for Silence of the Lambs.
Right, exactly. And it seems like horror has been fairly bankable genre at the box office in recent years. We've seen successes like Smile, Nope, and even Evil Dead Rise, all grossing over $100 million around the world in the last couple of years. What do you think it is about horror that has been so good at bringing audiences back to the movies since the pandemic?
Well, I think horror is really a kind of a magical genre. I think there's something very, very special about going into a place with a bunch of other people, turning out the lights, and sharing a scare. I think there's something that's irreplaceable about that you cannot get if you're sitting at home watching something on your home screen. There's something in that communal experience that's very, very rewarding. And I think that's the reason why horror has been and continues to be one of the top genres in film. It's a very, very nice communal experience to have, especially at the end when you're all walking out together chatting about the film.
Sure. Now, you cover a lot of ground in this book, looking at more than 120 years of films from around the globe. But even with all that, I'm sure there were things that you probably couldn't get to in the time that you were given in the book. Was there anything that missed the cut for the final book that you want to touch on, or any recent films you want to call out, perhaps?
Well, I'm one ambition. I was trying to be as comprehensive as humanly possible, and I often wondered why there weren't horror cinemas in Russia or China or in Africa. In none of those places is horror very prevalent or pronounced. And I wonder if there are regional cinemas or national cinemas that play a lot of films that we never see, that are horror films. And I thought if I was young and I had a backpack and a Eurail pass, I would go and sit in a bunch of movie theaters in Russia and China and try to figure out what their take on horror films were. So I'm curious as to what those national cinemas do. And it's interesting because many times totalitarian governments or fascist governments have outlawed horror films because they want people to believe that everything is just dandy the way it is. And so you find a lot of interesting horror content that comes from a kind of a social rebellion, a kind of desire to throw things into askew.
Right, and you touched on that in a couple of the chapters of the book. I think talking about the Italian cinema that came out of the post-war era,
right,
and the Spanish cinema that came out of the Franco areas as well.
That's very true, and in fact, it's very interesting. Spain for a long time did not allow horror films, and when it finally did, it did so under the stipulation that none of those films were set in Spain.
Right.
Because, of course, nothing bad could ever happen in Spain. So you see, so all these Spanish horror films are set in Germany, which doesn't really work with the decor, but that's how they played it.
Right. Now, at the end of the book, you included a list of horror films recognized by the Academy over the years. We touched on this just a minute ago. And the lack of horror nominees and winners at the Oscars always seems to pop up as a conversation whenever a horror film does creep into the nomination. What do you think it is about the films in the horror genre that keeps preventing them from being recognized by the Academy and other awards bodies?
Well, I think horror is a very disreputable genre. I think that we see it as something low and not very elevating at all, and it tends to be dismissive, and I think the film industry tends to be very dismissive of horror films as well. They are among the cheapest of films to produce, and they always seem to make a profit, no matter how good or bad they are. Believe me, I've seen a lot of good and a lot of bad movies. Yeah, it's crazy.
Great.
That's cool.
You had a few things listed in the references at the end of the book, but were there any specific books or articles that people should check out if they enjoyed your book and want to learn even more about the horror genre?
Yes, I actually made a list, so I have that together. Of course, I would always include first Stephen King's Danse Macabre. That's an excellent book on not only the literary but the film aspects of horror, and it's just a great foundational document. It's a wonderful book. There's a writer called David J. Skal, S-K-A-L, who wrote The Monster Show, A Cultural History of Horror. That is a book that I wish I had written. It's a wonderful book about the history of American horror. He's also written books about mad scientists and about Todd Browning, the guy who directed Freaks. So he's very much into writing about horror. Rick Worland wrote a book called The Horror Film, An Introduction, which is a great survey of horror film history from the 1920s to now. and The Rough Guide to Horror Movies. Sometimes these mass market books you think are not going to be that good, but Alan Jones wrote a great survey of the genre in that book.
Excellent. I'll be sure to put those in the show notes, and link to those where people can find them.
Cool.
Now, I have a couple of questions not specifically related to the book, but before I move on, is there anything else you want to touch on about the book?
No, I had a lot of fun writing it. It all took place because I went to the library to look for this book, and I found that there was no such book. And that's what made me determined to write this.
Excellent. Well, we're glad that you did.
Thank you.
Now, this might be the hardest question I ask. You've obviously watched a lot of films in your career and in your research for this book, but if you had to pick your top 3, what would you say they are?
Ooh, that's so hard, because I think about the ones there are ones that I love, but that are silly. But when I think about the ones that were really life-changing for me, I'd have to begin with The Bride of Frankenstein. That's just a classic. It's almost a perfect film, I think. And I have watched it countless times, and I keep finding new stuff in it. So that, to me, that's the definition of a classic. You keep coming back and you keep getting something out of it. So it's a very resonant film. Another film that really changed my life was Peeping Tom, the 1960 British film about a man who is a voyeur and a serial killer as well. But it's all done from his perspective, which was the first time that had ever been tried. And in his attempt to make this villain sympathetic, the director made a film that was banned and that destroyed his career, basically. So it's quite an amazing film, and it was worth a man's career. So there's that. And the third one, I would have to say, in terms of something that really changed my mind about things, was The Wicker Man, if you've ever seen that, from 1973, the folk horror film. You kind of see a philosophical principle carried to its logical extreme, which it puts a real bug in your ear about what organized religion and what spirituality is about, and does it in a very, very uncompromising way, so that by the end of the film, you're completely shattered. At least I was when I walked out of the theater. So those, I think, are my top 3.
Great. Now, from that, we move to a little bit of a fun question. If you could invite any 3 movie characters to your next dinner party, who would they be, and why would you invite those folks?
From the horror genre, or from any film?
Any genre. Doesn't have to be horror.
Oh, great. Okay, I was thinking about that. Well, first, I would invite Kambai from Seven Samurai. That was the man who led the samurai in the film.
Okay.
A very, very wise man indeed. I'd love to pick his brain about various topics. I always wanted to have a conversation with Peter O'Toole's Lawrence of Arabia. That's a very interesting and contradictory kind of character, and I'd like to dig into his ideas about things as well. And the third person, this is from a somewhat obscure French film, Garance from Children of Paradise, which was made in the 1940s and is about 18th century France. There's a fascinating woman at the center of this film who's loved by 3 different men in 3 different ways, and she's an endlessly fascinating creature. I would love to get her under the microscope.
Excellent. I don't think I've had those folks recommended before, so it's good to add those to the dinner party.
Cool.
Now, do you have any books that you've been reading that you could recommend? They could be fiction or nonfiction and don't necessarily even have to be about movies.
Okay. Well, I just look at my pile of stuff next to my bed. Right now I'm reading an interesting biography of the Marx brothers. It's called Four of the Three Musketeers, and it concerns itself solely with their stage appearances. So it's a fascinating look into the beginnings of their careers and watching how they developed into the act that they became. And it's the most meticulously researched book I've ever read in my life. The guy who did it went to all the local papers across the country looking for theatrical ads and theatrical reviews. And it's an amazing compilation of data. What else am I reading? I'm reading Montaigne's essays. Michel de Montaigne, a 16th century French guy who is very funny. It's hard to find something 500 years old that you can laugh, makes you laugh out loud, and that's one of them for sure. Gosh, one book I'm rereading that I really love is a book called On the Air, the Encyclopedia of Old Time Radio. Its author, John Dunning, was a mentor of mine, and he passed away recently. And he's just a wonderful writer of both fiction and nonfiction, so I go to that to kind of refresh my mind and to keep myself clear in my head about how to write clearly and succinctly.
Excellent. And lastly, before we wrap things up here, I know you've just finished this book, but what projects do you have lined up next? Anything else we can look forward to?
Well, the next thing I'm working on is it's another despised film genre. It's comic book movies. Superhero films, and not just superhero films, but all films that have been derived from graphic novels, from comic strips, from comic books. Just kind of taking a look at what Hollywood has done with that content. And of course, we're living in the age of superhero movies now, and there's much debate over if they're bad for us, if they're not really cinema, if they're dragging us all down into the muck of illiteracy. And I just think that's a very interesting reaction to what basically is just another rather harmless genre in my mind. So I'm looking at that, and I'm looking at how people perceive those films, and whether those films actually do what they are intended to do, which is to render those fantastic universes into something tangible that everyone can see.
Great. Well, we'll look forward to that and hopefully be able to have you back on when that book comes out.
Cool. Thank you.
Well, Brad, thank you so much for your time today. I really appreciated you speaking with me and sharing your thoughts about the horror genre.
And thank you for having me on. I appreciate it.
Thank you again to my guest today, Brad Weismann. His newest book, Horror Unmasked, A History of Terror from Nosferatu to Nope, is out now, and I'll have a link to where you can pick that up in the show notes, along with links to movies and books mentioned throughout the interview. The Oscar Project is written and produced by me, Jonathan Eterberg, with editing assistance from Joshua Eterberg. Please come back for my next episode, where I will be speaking with Matt Segalov about his upcoming book, Say Hello to My Little Friend, A Century of Scarface. Until then, I hope to see you at the movies.